Hey guys, welcome to my channel. My name is ReadingBear and I hope you are ready for some more stories. And today, we'll take a look at some new entitled people content. If you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comment. And now, let's dive right into the stories.
The first story is titled, Smug Neighbor Parked Stolen Car in My Driveway, Massive Mistake. He Gets Towed. About 3 years ago, my mother passed away. It was absolutely devastating, and I can tell just how much it hurt my dad. He was all alone in this big house that him and my mother built their lives on. He became depressed, and my sister and I quickly became worried about him. After a year, my sister and I invited my dad to come live with one of us so that he wasn't as lonely. Both of us lived in the next city over, so we were not at all far from my dad, but we thought that maybe dad would feel better if he had someone to live with, rather than live alone. However, my dad declined. He didn't say it directly, but essentially, he still wanted to be able to maintain his independence. He was in his late 60s, and although he had arthritis, he was fine for the most part. So, we compromised and got my dad a nice little house in the same city as us. The house he used to live in with my mom, and the house my sister and I grew up in, went up for sale and a distant relative actually bought it, so it stayed within the family. My dad moved into his new house, and he had a 2016 Aveo car. Now, my dad is pretty much a homebody. He likes being in the comfort of his own home and personalized space. And because he was in the downtown area of the city, now he could walk to places around him. So, his car wouldn't move for weeks at a time. His next-door neighbors, a young couple in their 20s, had taken advantage of this, and had made a deal with my dad to park one of their cars in his driveway. This couple had 3 cars, but only 2 could fit in their driveway. My dad was a pretty mellow guy, so he had let them. They parked behind his car, which I thought was pretty inconvenient. However, my dad said that the few times he wanted to take his car out for the day, he just went next door and asked them to move their car, and they were always very polite about it, and moved it right away. Credit given to my father because I probably wouldn't want my neighbor's car in my driveway. But it worked out for them. Until one day when my dad had wanted to drive to the other side of town and get lunch at this little cafe him and my mom used to go to. He had gone over to the neighbor's house to ask them to move the car. The wife that usually drove the car was nowhere to be found, and the husband said that she was out with their other car, and that she had the keys for the car sitting in my dad's driveway. He said he would call her to come move the real car with quick. Now this is where I have a problem. The guy seemed nice and all, but the car didn't move for another 4 hours. By then, it was too dark for my dad to drive comfortably, as he has some vision problems. It was pretty inconsiderate. My dad was nice enough to let these people park in his driveway, and they were starting to be dicks about it. Well, a couple of days later my dad called me up wanting to know if I wanted to pick him up and go to car show. Well, it was like one of those parking lot meetups with old cars. My dad loved cars, and I was just happy my dad was wanting to get out of the house for once. So, of course I said yes. However, there was a problem when I arrived at his house. My dad had wanted to take his car, but the neighbor's car was blocking it. He had told me that he had went over and asked the neighbor to move it when he called me that morning, which was about 2 hours prior to me showing up at my dad's house. I had said no problem, that I would take care of it. Got on my phone and called a tow truck to come get this asshole's car. I was very protective over my dad since my mom passed away. It seemed that he was lonely and lacking something in his life, and I think sometimes people could probably tell, and took advantage of him. Well, not on my watch. The tow truck arrived shortly, and everything was going well because the next door neighbors weren't coming out to see what all the noise was about. Well, until the tow truck driver was getting ready to drive off. Both the guy and his wife come running out, yelling at my dad, and asking him, what the duck did he think he was doing? I calmly explained to them that they would not be allowed to park in my dad's driveway anymore, as they were taking advantage of him, and I would not stand for it. The guy then starts going on this long rant about how he doesn't have proper documentation for the car, and he didn't know how he was going to get it back. He started begging the tow truck driver to take the car off, but the driver told him that once the car was on the truck, he legally had to take it to the tow yard. The guy was pissed. Well, come to find out that he never got his nice little sports car back because apparently it was stolen. I found out through one of my dad's neighbors that the husband had been arrested because the car had been reported stolen and the police linked it back to this guy. The girlfriend claimed she had no idea, that her husband just showed up to the house one day saying he bought a car. I started to wonder if that's why they wanted to park the car in my dad's driveway in the first place. If the police had found it there, my dad would have been responsible since it was on his property. Regardless, the husband went to jail for carjacking, and the wife moved out of the house shortly after. Luckily, they were just renting the house, so they moved out pretty fast, and my dad was able to move in and out of his driveway whenever he wanted. Oh, and my sister moved in next door to him. They frequently have lunch dates, and we all get together on the weekends to have breakfast at a cafe that my mom used to love. The next story is titled, "It's Community Property." Not me, thankfully, but a good friend. He had come into some money, so, after setting aside a college fund for his kids, he's divorced, he decided to buy himself a toy in the form of a new Tesla SUV. Now even though there's charging stations popping up everywhere, he decided to install a charging station in his garage so he wouldn't have to be going all over the place. Got the station installed, got his car, and life went on. Enter one of his neighbors whom we'll call, I don't know, Karen. Karen and her hubby had an older model Tesla and, like most people, used the public chargers for their car. One day my friend came home to find Karen angrily trying to open his garage door. When he, somewhat, politely asked what the hell she was doing, she told him she needed to use the public charging station for her car and that he was illegally blocking her access by keeping his garage door locked. When he told her that the charger was his personal one, she angrily rebuked him by saying that all Tesla chargers were public property and that he was breaking the law by blocking his. I actually checked on this, and a home Tesla charging station only costs a few grand. He politely told her to F off, put his car in the garage, and closed the door. A little while later there was a knock on the door, and he opened it to find a cop with a smug-looking Karen standing behind him. The cop explained that he was responding to a "blocking access to public property" complaint. It took him a second, but then he took the cop, who seemed embarrassed to be there, to his garage, showed him his car and the charger, showed him the invoice for the charging station. The cop nodded, went outside, had a conversation with Karen, who screeched something unintelligible. End of story, right? Well, one day my friend comes home to find his garage door half bashed into the point he can't open the damn thing. He then does what any normal person would. He looked at the security feed from the cameras he had for his house. And there, in HD, was Karen psychotically hammering at his garage door with a small sledge. He calls the cops, and Karen is hauled out of her home and is facing charges of attempted break and enter and damaging private property. Oh, and my friend is suing her for damages to his home. Just to plug in her damn car. The next story is titled, "How My Dad Didn't Go to Vietnam." In 1969, my dad graduated from Rice University with a 5-year master's in chemical engineering. Edit. Since so many commenters seem to think he was some kind of rich kid. His parents both taught public school, and he went to college on a full academic scholarship. The Vietnam War was raging, and although he and his classmates had all received deferments during their studies, their deferments were over, and it was time for them to go before the draft board. Most of his classmates weren't worried, because they were slated to see the Houston Draft Board, which had a reputation for handing out continued deferments like Halloween candy. However, my dad is from Oklahoma, which meant that he had to be evaluated by the Tulsa Draft Board, which was much, much stricter. Dad had applied to the chemical engineering PhD program at Stanford and had been accepted with a full stipend. He was excited to go, but first he had to get past the draft board. The Stanford faculty wrote a letter to the Tulsa Draft Board, explaining that Mr. Hammer would be embarking on a research program that would greatly benefit the war effort and asking for another deferment. The Tulsa Draft Board wrote back in short order. Mr. Hammer had already benefited from the only deferment he was going to get, and thus he was to present himself to the Army Physical Examination Center post haste. Dad was sad to lose his shot at a PhD, but not too sad, because now he could marry my mom. He'd also had several job offers already, so he accepted an offer from Exxon and he and my mom got married. His superiors at Exxon wrote another letter to the Tulsa Draft Board, explaining that Mr. Hammer was now gainfully employed in the oil and gas industry, where he would be conducting engineering research that would greatly benefit the war effort, and asking for another deferment. Just as quickly, the Tulsa Draft Board wrote back, reiterating that Mr. Hammer was not going to receive another deferment, and that if he didn't hurry up and get his army physical, they might have to get the law involved. Disappointed, my dad went to his army physical as scheduled. He's always been a healthy guy, and he performed just fine on most of the examinations, up until the very end, when they measured his heart rate. It was over 100 beats per minute. "Well, we can't pass you with that," said the army doctors. "But you're probably just nervous. Come back in 2 weeks and we'll give you another physical." "Nervous?" said my dad to himself. "I can work with that." For the next 2 weeks, my dad spent every spare moment basically teaching himself the opposite of meditation. He'd close his eyes and think of the most horrifying mental images he could, trying to drive his heart rate as high as possible. Finally, the day of the physical arrived, and things went much as before. He passed nearly everything with flying colors, but when the time came to measure his heart rate, once again it was well over 100. The army doctors promptly diagnosed him with tachycardia, scored his physical 4F, and sent him home. He's in his 70s now, and apart from his mysteriously high heart rate, which I inherited, he's always been in great cardiac health and still is. The next story is titled, "How I Got My Landlord Arrested for Auto Theft." I used to live in a rental townhome. The place was great. It was run by a big company, but they paid an on-site super to run the office, coordinate repairs, etc. When I moved in, it was this nice older retired couple. Few years later they moved on and the company hired these two young dudes. They were assholes. Recent college grads who looked down on the blue-collar tenants, did loud parties all night, generally ignored the grounds, ignored maintenance requests, etc. But that's not how I got them arrested. In addition to renting the townhouse, you could rent a covered spot. If you did, they gave you a hang tag, and if you didn't have the hang tag, you'd get towed. I had the same car, same spot and same tag the whole time I lived there. One day I come out and my car is gone. It was towed for no hang tag, but in the pictures the tow company took it's clearly there. I paid to get it out and complained to the two idiots. They had to call to authorize a tow, company couldn't just do it on their own. They gave me a half-assed apology. About a week later, same problem. Again, towed for no tag, again, tag's right there. This time I called the corporate office and complained. After that, it started happening nearly every day. When I'd talk to the supers about it, they'd just laugh. I knew they were doing it on purpose, so I did some research. The tow company gave me the names of the people who called it in, and it was mostly one guy but some the other. The tow company wasn't liable because the landlords had called them, so that was out. But I did some research and found out that in my state, calling for a tow when you know it's not a legal tow is grand theft auto, just like if you broke into a car. I also found out you can record conversations in my state without telling the other person. So, I went in to meet the two bros to talk about the situation. They told me, on tape, that the first 2 times were mistakes, but after that they did it on purpose and would keep doing so until I learned my lesson. They stated that they knew I was okay to park there, but they didn't care. I took that recording and the list of calls to a buddy who's an attorney, and he helped me take it to the local police. Police were more than happy to have a couple felony charges dropped into their laps, so they filed charges and went to arrest them. Corporate fired them same day, refunded all of my fees for getting my car out of hock, and gave me a rental discount for a few months. They both ended up eating the felony and got probation. Last I heard, they weren't able to find decent jobs because of the felonies and also couldn't pay their student loans. Both ended up working construction, which they'd sneered at, because that's all they had left. The next story is titled, "Don't Touch the Tomatoes? Okay, there will be none." This happened to my mother recently. For context, the neighbor and her have driveways that are side by side with a small patch of dirty gravel and weeds between that is basically no man's land and is just there. It's about 1.5 feet wide, runs the length of the driveway, and no one really takes care of it, leaving it as a border. My mom also has plenty of tomatoes growing in the backyard, including cherry tomatoes that are a favorite of crows stealing and other birds. Now this spot was a favorite for birds to drop the tomatoes or pick them apart because there were no dogs there while there were in the backyard or main yards. Or at least that's how my mom tells it. Eventually the seeds sprout and there are small tomato plants starting to grow. Noticing them, my mom begins to water them regularly as she waters her front yard plants, as she has to walk by them with the hose anyways. This leads to cherry tomato plants sprouting and becoming incredibly fruitful between the driveways. After a while, they were disappearing, and my mom figured it was a combination of the birds and the wife of the neighbor couple because she was home all day. My mom didn't care because these were just chance tomatoes, she had plenty in the backyard garden, and it was just nice to have something more than dirt and gravel between the driveways. All was dandy until my mom went to grab a few to snack on while working in the front yard and the woman next door confronted her. She told my mother those were not her tomatoes and she needed to leave them alone. The neighbor woman continued that the patch of dirt and gravel was on her property, not my mother's, though our water meter was in it and ultimately it was likely a 50-50 split if you even cared to look, which when it was just nothing, no one cared to. So rather than argue with her, my mom said it was fine and she was leave them alone. A few weeks later they had started to dry up and die without the frequent watering from my mom, eventually ending in the dirt and gravel patch becoming just that again. The last story is titled, Wearing Sunglasses Indoors. I read someone else's navel story and it reminded me of my compliance story. I used to really have trouble with light sensitivity, likely from leaving my contacts in way longer than I should have. I finally ditched the contacts altogether and opted for glasses. I opted for civilian glasses, rather than navy issue because they were downright fugly. The ones I picked had a slight tint for indoor lighting and would get darker in sunlight for use outdoors. You could still see my eyes clearly, but I really was wearing almost sunglasses indoors. This setup was fine and dandy until I was stationed on my ship. My chief passed me in the corridor one day and stopped me voicing his displeasure with my choice of eyewear, demanding that I go to medical and get Navy-issue glasses to wear while on the boat. While I wasn't happy with this, I of course went to see the doctor. They sent me out to the medical center on base where I was evaluated, poked, prodded, dilated, etc. And ended up being diagnosed as photophobic, fancy word for light sensitive. They special ordered me government-issued glasses and sent me back to the ship to wait for them to arrive. Took time and a couple pairs. Shockingly, the first set sent out weren't correct. Had some rose-colored tint that made things worse, but I finally received my newly minted, government-issued glasses. They were straight-up sunglasses. The doc on the ship made sure that my medical diagnosis was entered into my record and sent me off to work. I admit I had some difficulty indoors in poorly lit areas of the ship, but I dutifully wore my fugly navy glasses. Didn't see the chief for a bit, but once I did, he popped his cork big time. He marched me right down to the doc's office on the ship and started giving the doc a hard time. He thought that I was given control over what was issued to me, was ready to bend me over a barrel. Doc shut him down and actually showed him my medical record and diagnosis. So much for privacy. I continued to wear my fuglies a couple months until my chief finally relented and allowed me to return to my civilian glasses. Not sure if that happened after the CO saw me. But it likely had something to do with it. Thank you for listening.